Okay, good afternoon, everybody. And I'd like to firstly say thank you to the HSP support group for asking us to speak today. As you can see, we're going to focus in on spasticity that can affect people's movement in HSP, looking at causes, impact, and management. And also, as you can see up there, we're going to be quite ambitious and try a quadruple act in the next hour. So if we keep to time, that'll be a miracle. So I'm going to start off looking very broadly at some of the difficulties that people can have with movement in HSP. And my name's Jon Marsden, and I'm a physiotherapist, professor of rehabilitation at the University of Plymouth. I'm then going to hand over to Gabriela Gonzalez-Chan, who's a PhD student with a biomedical engineering background, who is doing some work looking at assessment for spasticity in people with HSP as well as other conditions. And then finally, we're going to hand over to Estelle, you've already met, and Dr. Lisa Bunn, who's also a physiotherapist at the University of Plymouth. And they're going to talk about one potential treatment that we're interested in researching further, and we'd like your input in on this, namely the Mollii suit. So I'm going to make a start and start quite broadly. And so you can see from the diagram on the left-hand side that HSP is caused by a multitude of genes. In fact, there are now over 100 genes that have been identified that can cause HSP. And as you can see from this diagram, the genes can actually be located on virtually every chromosome that we have. And you can get all types of inheritance: autosomal dominant, recessive, X-linked inheritance, inheritance via the mitochondrial genes as well. Yes. Okay, and so many of you might identify the ones on there that you actually do have. And so you can see that HSP is complicated, but there are a number, or one particular process that many of these genes are involved in that are important for the health of the nerve. And that's something called axonal transport. So you can see on the diagram on the right-hand side a diagrammatic picture of a nerve with the cell body on one end with the nucleus. And then you've got this long axon, and at the end you've got synapses where the nerve will communicate with other nerves, and that's the way the signals flow, the electrical signals flow, and you communicate with other nerves. And so things are made up at the top in the cell body, and essentially they need to go down the nerve to get to the end, to the synapses. So, for example, you might need to move certain organelles, which are important in generating energy, the mitochondria, right down to the end. And similarly, there needs to be a pathway to send signals back up to the nucleus. So at the end of the nerve, the membrane can invaginate and take in substances from the immediate environment. And this forms something called an endosome, which is encased in the lipid fatty membrane that we have around our cells. And this endosome needs to move up to tell the cell body about what's happening. So essentially, we've got a transport system here. Think about it having a motorway, and think about it having vehicles moving up and down, and people packaging at the top and at the bottom, packaging things to put on the vehicles. And different genes in HSP can affect all of these types of processes depending on the gene. Sometimes it's the motorway it's affected, sometimes it's the motor, the vehicle that's been affected, sometimes it's the packaging. But ultimately what this does is it means that the axon health is affected if this breaks down, and it particularly will affect the long axons because they're the ones that need axonal transport the most, and they have the most energy requirement. And in our brain, we've got some very long axons which start at the top of our brain and go all the way down the spinal cord. They can be over 1 meter long, and they're involved in movement called the corticospinal neurons. But also you can have neurons that start at the bottom and send signals up about what your body is doing up to the brain as well. So they're sensory ones. And you can see that when these are affected, they will give rise to some characteristic problems with movement, which are just shown here, and I'm briefly going to touch on. So firstly, if we And before I go any further, I'm just going to be talking about these symptoms, which is what you see in the uncomplicated form of HSP. Some of you will have additional symptoms, which is called complicated HSP. So some people might have ataxia in coordination, additional problems with muscle myopathy, neuropathy as well. And just from time point of view, we're just going to concentrate on these more simpler systems and spasticity in particular. So firstly, we can see that when the signals from the brain down to the spinal cord are affected, it can give rise to weakness because the drive to the nerves supplying the muscles are affected. So this is summarizing on the left-hand side some work we've done previously, highlighting that in people with HSP compared to healthy controls, the muscles are weaker and the strength gets less as you go generally from the hips to the knees to the ankles. It's not as simple as that. The two muscles that take the brunt of the weakness are the ones shown on the right-hand side, the hip abductors, which are on the side of your hip, very important for side-to-side stability. And when this is affected, you might see a characteristic type of lurching side to side when people walk. And also the ankle dorsiflexors, Estelle's already touched on, they lift your ankle up and they can also be affected. And that will give rise to a foot drop that could cause people to trip, for example. And these muscles are particularly affected because they have a strong corticospinal supply and they're innervated by quite low segments of the spine, so the nerves driving them are quite long. We can also see that people have balance problems, and this is some work done by a group more recently in Holland. And what they've done is they've looked at balance perturbations. So, for example, if you were standing on a bus and it suddenly moved, lurched forwards, or suddenly stopped, you would have to react to that movement, or if someone knocked into you. And the way you react to that is you sense the movements through movements of the joints and stretch on the muscles, send signals up to the brain to release a response. And that sort of response is shown on the right, on your left-hand side. You can see someone's had a platform which suddenly moves backwards, they move forwards, and the muscles on the back of the body, called the gastrocnemius, hamstrings, paraspinal muscles, the back of the body contract to save yourself. And the graph shown here show that the dotted line are people with HSP and the solid line are people with healthy age-matched controls. You can see that people with HSP produce a response, but it's delayed in time. So that's why the line is higher each time. And because of that, when you have a perturbation, you move forwards for a lot more than other people because you won't produce the corrective response in time, and that in turn will affect your balance. Added to that, the muscles are that bit weaker, so the actual size of the response can be smaller, and that will affect your balance. And the last one I'm going to talk about, which is the focus for the rest of this, is hypertonia and spasticity. Estelle's also already mentioned that sometimes people's stiffness isn't due to changes in spasticity, but it can, as shown on the right-hand side, be due to changes in the muscle itself. So the muscles can be shorter, and we know from other patient groups there can be more connective tissue around the muscles as well, which makes the muscle itself just tighter. And this is called a passive stiffness. And we can look at this by stretching people really slowly so we don't actually elicit spasticity. And what is spasticity? That's shown on the left-hand side. So spasticity will be a heightened stretch reflex. So here, someone's using a patella hammer to stretch the quadriceps muscle, your thigh muscle on the front. That's detected by specialist stretch receptors in the muscle, sends signals into the spinal cord, which is shown in the middle, and that connects to the nerves that supply that same muscle and make that muscle contract. So you stretch the muscle, hit the patella, and then the tendon connecting the patella, and then you get a contraction. Now, controlling that stretch reflex, there's a lot of circuitry in the spinal cord. So, for example, when I stretch one muscle, you will activate an inhibitory pathway, which will make the opposite muscle relax, called reciprocal inhibition. And similarly, if I contracted the hamstrings, I activate the pathway to relax my quadriceps. And all of these pathways are once again under control by these centers, these pathways going from the brain down to the spinal cord. So when these are affected, this inhibition is less and the reflexes get heightened in nature. And that will then, when you move, the muscles will contract, and that makes the limb stiffer, and especially when you're trying to move quickly. We also know from other groups of people with spasticity that there can be changes within the nerves supplying the muscles as well. They will tend to produce a bigger response to a stretch stimulus coming in. So that's some of the symptoms in a brief summary. I'm now going to pass over to Gabby, who's going to talk about some of the work she's been doing at Plymouth, looking at assessing spasticity and hypertonia.
Hi, everyone. I will start saying that maybe some of you have already heard about this project because I know it's been put in the newsletter, and Jon joined one of the online meetings a few months ago to talk about it. So like Jon said, my background is in biomedical engineering. So this project is a collaboration between the School of Health Professions and the School of Engineering at the University of Plymouth. So the main aim that we're trying to do with this is we're trying to create a prototype of a robotic leg that simulates the behavior of a spastic limb, with the idea of using it as a teaching tool for clinicians who get involved in the assessment of a spasticity. Because as you can imagine, it's quite hard to explain to people what a spasticity is, and it feels like without actually have a hands-on experience on it. So one of the things that we're doing with this project is we want to compare spasticity across different conditions, because as Jon mentioned, there's other things going on at the same time as a spasticity. So a spasticity is just one of the symptoms. So we're looking at people with MS, as well as people who had suffered from a stroke and people with HSP in this project. And as an add-on, we also want to investigate the impact that it can have on functional activities, such as walking and balance. So how are we doing all of this? Is we created this study to have stretches at different speeds. So like Jon was explaining, spasticity is activated by the velocity of the movement. So basically we activate the threshold of the stretch reflex. So we're doing stretches at different velocities. So first we move people's limb quite slowly, so we can measure that passive stiffness that Jon was talking about. And then we increase the velocity to see how much we're increasing that stretch reflex and how much that affects on the movement. So the idea is then that we use all these values to create the prototype that I'm talking about, which would then become the teaching tool. And as for the functional part, we're doing some 5-meter walk tests where we ask people to walk at the normal walking speed, and then we ask them to work at a fast walking, just to see how it affects while they're doing that. And then we do some standing balance, which is just standing with your feet apart for 30 seconds. And we do this twice. So we do it with your eyes open and with your eyes closed. And we just measure how much you're swaying while you're doing this assessment. So I'm going to show some of the results that we've had. So we can see here, where is the mouse? Thank you. So we can see here, this is the stretches that I'm talking about. So we're using a motor because with this way we can control the velocity of the stretch, and we can also control the range of motion. So it's always a 20-degree range of motion, and we're moving it at first at 5 degrees per second, which is a really slow stretch. So it takes 4 seconds to do a whole degree of motion. And you can see here on the screen, we are recording as well EMG, so the muscle activity, where we're doing this stretches just with the idea of seeing that response that we're expecting once we increase the velocity. And then we're also recording the torque, which is a resistance to that movement. So in a slow stretch, as expected, we're not activating that stretch reflex. Like as Jon said, this is all passive stiffness. We can see here at the end, it can be that we're stretching the person up to that range, and then it becomes more stiff. If we increase the velocity for a medium stretch, you can see the difference on how fast the movement is now. And as a response, we get now a stretch reflex on the quads, which is the muscle on the front of your leg. And you can see the hamstring doesn't have any response. And then we can see the increase on the torque. So once we activate that reflex, your muscle comes into activation, and therefore it's resisting the movement. And for a fast stretch, we're using 175 degrees per second stretch, which is quite fast. And we can see that the stretch reflex response is higher, it's prolonged, and we can also see a little bit of a response on the hamstrings. So we're actually getting a little bit of co-contraction in some of the participants, and this is something that can be looked into with more in depth, because we're not sure what's causing that contraction at the moment. And we can see the increase on the torque, which is the resistance to the movement. So now we're going to compare that. Sorry, why is it not changing? There we go. Sorry. So now we can see the difference between a healthy control and someone with a spasticity in HSP. And for the slow stretches, it's quite similar, but the values of the torque is quite lower on healthy controls, which means the resistance to the movement is less because they don't have that passive stiffness. But if we compare the fast stretches, we can see on a healthy control, we don't have that stretch reflex response when we move fast. So that's the spasticity, and that's what we're trying to compare between groups. As another test that we're doing, we are using a pendulum test. Now, what this is we stretch the person's leg out, and what we do is we just let it drop and swing freely with the gravity. So that's where the name comes from. It's a pendulum test. And with this test, we're using an electrogoniometer, which is this sensor here, which gives us the range of motion of the knee. And then on the bottom, we have a small sensor, which is an accelerometer, which also gives you the velocity of the leg, and we can get that knee trace as well. At the same time, we are measuring the muscle response. So we can see here how for patient and for healthy control, if you look at the response of the quads, you see that elicit response, which is the stretch reflex. So in some patients, you will see that just the velocity of the gravity, the acceleration of the gravity is enough to activate that stretch reflex. Therefore, it will have less big response and less swing. So some papers and some studies have used this test to kind of simulate the behavior of a spastic knee before. And what they do is they measure the magnitude of the swings, so how much it's moving and how fast it's coming into a rest position. So for people who are more stiff, you'll see there's less swings and takes less time to come into a rest. So we can use this to correlate it to the levels of a spasticity. And it's quite a simple test that can be done at home if people want to measure that. And here we can see the difference, for example, between passive stiffness and stretch reflex. So on the one on this side, we can see the swing is way less, but we don't have a response on the muscle, which will imply that there's a passive stiffness, which means the leg is quite stiff. So when we drop it, it takes longer to come down, and it just kind of stays in this position. Whether in the first one, he'll be someone that has a spasticity, but not necessarily that passive stiffness. So this is what we're looking at. And now I'm going to pass on to Estelle to talk about. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah.
So just to introduce the next part, just very briefly on management. So we've already touched on one of the mainstays of management when Estelle was doing exercises is physiotherapy, occupational therapy, self-management. But there are other ways we can look at management of spasticity and passive stiffness. There are certain anti-spasticity medications, botulinum toxin injections, baclofen amongst some of the drugs that you can use. And you can also have treatments for the passive component. There is literature out there looking mainly at pediatric populations of people with HSP, children looking at muscle lengthening operations if they got very contracted, similar to happens in cerebral palsy. And there are also some more up-to-date techniques, such as this thing called extracorporeal shockwave therapy, which is essentially a very deep massage of the muscles, and that seems to have quite significant effects on decreasing passive stiffness. There are also something called dorsal rhizotomy, which is an operation also undertaken in children with cerebral palsy with spasticity, where the inputs, the sensory inputs to the spinal cord are cut. And so this can disrupt the stretch reflex arc and decrease spasticity. But the one thing I wanted to just introduce, and that's the segue into Estelle and Lisa, is that there are certain electrical stimulation techniques that are already out there that can be useful. So many of you might have come across functional electrical stimulation, where, for example, you might be stimulating the nerves that go to the muscles that lift the foot up. That can help with foot drop, but we also know that that can decrease spasticity in the muscle behind the leg, the plantar flexors or the calf muscle. And that seems to occur because you activate this reciprocal inhibition pathway we talked about. And more recently, at the bottom, there have been studies, and they are very few, so they're just starting out, but they've been done on HSP, where you can maybe change the excitability of the motor cortex using direct stimulation, which has had an impact on people's weakness and people's spasticity, at least in the short term. And there on the far hand side at the bottom, there is a technique called spinal direct current stimulation, where there is electrical stimulation, pads placed on the spinal cord, either side of the spinal cord, and there is a stimulation there. And once again, we think the mechanism of action there is that we're affecting the circuits in the spinal cord, activating these inhibitory circuits. And these have also been shown in HSP and in other groups to decrease spasticity, at least in the short term. So there are some stimulation paradigms that seem to be useful. And we're now going to turn our attention to another stimulation paradigm that's come onto the market, which is the Exopulse Mollii suit. And I'm now going to hand over to Estelle, who's just going to provide a user's experience and reflection on this suit.
I bought Mollii suit in January this year. So after talking to a few people who have HSP, who turned around and said how beneficial it was, well, I thought I want to be as physically as good as I can be. So I went and tried it, and amazingly, I could really feel the difference after trying it. So it's got 58 electrodes built into it, and they're positioned already. But when you put it on, you've got to get like your knee bit over the knee so that your hamstring electrode is in the right place, and your calf, because there's the electrodes basically are positioned over particular muscles. And so I wear it every morning. You also see you've got your top, you've got your bottom, and you've got this that goes around your middle. And basically these contain magnets in them. So basically that magnets onto there, and then you switch it on. So you're wearing it, you switch it on, and you just press the play button. And it is actually that simple, and it's got rechargeable batteries. I wear it every morning, and I wake up after doing 2 hours exercise the day before, because I am sort of addicted to exercise now at this point in my life. A bit stiff and a bit achy. I wear it for an hour, and that's eased off then. And then I'm ready to crack on with the day and do some more exercise. And I've really seen an improvement, which is why when they asked me about getting involved with this study, I was like, yes, please. Because actually, I think it's improved my quality of life, and I'd like it to have the opportunity to improve other people's. I'll hand over to Lisa.
Great. Hi folks. So as Jon said, I'm also a physiotherapist, and my background has been predominantly working with people with a condition called ataxia, which is also another rare condition, although you might also have ataxia relative to HSP and other related neurological conditions like having sensory loss. You can sometimes see a sensory ataxia, so it's a bit confusing because it refers to both a set of symptoms, but also a genetically diagnosed condition type. I basically was approached by an ataxia charity about a year and a half ago to say that occasionally people with ataxia have been trying the Expulse Mollii suit. And would we possibly design some research to explore whether or not it's actually effective? And I was really interested in this because the Expulse Mollii suit has really been designed with spasticity in mind rather than ataxia. And you'll explore on the website, if you do take a look, quite a lot of information about how the Mollii can treat spasticity. But, and I'm a bit more skeptical than Estelle, they don't really go into the whys and hows, which makes me a little bit concerned as a clinician, as well as it being about, am I allowed to say?
Yeah,
£5,000. Yes, it's a considerable investment.
Yeah.
And for that not to have any hard evidence base behind it, as a clinician, as you know, my colleagues who may be tempted to recommend it to their patients, there's a barrier there because it's a lot of money, and if it actually isn't effective, we shouldn't really be recommending its use. So it's really exciting to me to hear that people are having positive experiences, but we also have to remember that this isn't something that you're not sure, you know, when it's working, when it's not working. You are mindfully pressing that button and expecting to see a result. And it's very, very well documented that if we expect to see a result, we will find one, because we are by nature optimistic humans. And that's not to say that there isn't an effect there. That's just to say that we need to be cautious, especially when things are so phenomenally expensive to purchase. So this was really tempting for me as a physiotherapist to be involved with, because on the one hand, I'm seeing very promising early reports of effectiveness. On the other hand, with my research hat on, I'm thinking, oh, let's be careful here. And in order for this, if it is effective, let's imagine, in order for this to reach everybody inclusively, it's not good enough to just recommend it to people who can afford it. It should go right to the heart of our NHS. So we should be able to influence commissioners to make this accessible for all, if it's effective. So hopefully that's giving you a bit of an insight as to why we're interested in exploring the Mollii suit using an independent evaluation. And by that, I mean, we are not linked. We don't have shares in the company. We don't have friends who work in the company. We're truly impartial. So here's an idea that has been derived through initially working with people with ataxia, so may not be perfect for persons with HSP, which is partly why we're here today, to see, you know, how well would this fit if you are interested in exploring the Mollii suit using research. And it also aspires to quite rigorously evaluate the suit. So here goes. Here's a little picture that we've produced. So if you imagine that we have 48 people interested in being participants in the study, what we would do is we would randomly allocate you to one of two starter groups. The first starter group will have the suit supplied, which very kindly we've negotiated with the manufacturers would be free. And you would receive this via a visit from the representative who traditionally assesses and gives out suits in the UK. And the first group, the active Mollii group, would have the suit and it would be switched on for the 4 weeks. And Otterbock are just about, I'm not sure we should put this on YouTube, but we have the ability to control that effectively remotely. So you wouldn't know whether it was stimulating or not. You would be pressing the same button, you'll see the same set of lights. There is some question as to how effective a sham condition would be. Is everybody happy with the word sham? That's the pretend activation. So yeah, so what we would like to do is to have a pretend activation, which is almost unnoticeably different to the active application, so that we can really truly measure the real effect and not the psychologically modified effect. So imagining that feel of the suit is comparable with the stimulation on to off, which arguably it might not be, we would give half the persons an initial activated 4 weeks, half of the persons randomly assigned to the sham condition. But then we would switch it over, so give another 4 weeks of what we call washout. So if any effect was to have happened and you might have made some gains in your physical functioning, independence related to physical functioning, by 4 weeks, all of the literature that has evaluated this suit to date in other condition types, like children and young adults with cerebral palsy, people with multiple sclerosis, the literature suggests that by 2 weeks of non-use, everything goes back to normal. So this suit cannot cure, but it would be a bit like, if it was to be effective, picking up a walking stick. So as you're using it, you've got an immediate benefit. If you stop using it, you would no longer have that benefit. So bearing that in mind, if we give everybody a 4-week period, which is completely free from using the suit, hopefully that should bring everybody back to baseline again. Okay, so then we can switch over the groups. Those who had sham now have an activated 4 weeks. Those who have previously 4 weeks of activation now are part of the sham group. We'd measure each of these timescales before and after the 4-week period of use. So we'll have a comparison set of measures. And then at the end of what would then be 3 times 4, 12 weeks, think about that, we would hope to have concluded all of our assessment measures. We might need to have another 2 weeks just to check that those who had the active stimulation the second half of the trial really do return to baseline. Or we might choose to just say, okay, everybody who's been involved, now use it as you wish to use it, and we'll just explore the impact of that. So that's called an open label period. And that's quite interesting to researchers as well, to know, well, okay, if it works or doesn't work, regardless, is it acceptable? Is it something that people are going to use? Or, is it just not practical at the end of the day? So the little clipboard symbol at the very end denotes that we'd like to ultimately finish off with interviews for those persons who'd like to offer an interview. At the bottom, you can see a little sort of overview of what we would intend to do in terms of taking outcome measures. Clinical trials with conditions like ataxia and HSP are really challenging to effectively implement because everybody's so spread around the country, right? We don't want to keep bringing you into a fixed site because the type of outcome measures that we collect within the sort of physiotherapy domain are all dependent on fatigue. And quick show of hands, how many of you find that your fatigue levels quickly go up with transport, driving, public transport and the like? Okay, so that can have a real profound impact for some people. So that would really confound and bias the measures that we're taking. So we've got two other options. One is send researchers out into the home environment. And if we do that, we spend thousands of pounds on the researcher travel time and costs related. But we get really precise, hopefully, independent measures. Or we design a remotely assessed trial. And on balance, and incorporating views from people with ataxia so far, we've been steered towards designing a remote trial. The benefits of that are zero fatigue related to travel, lower costs, and also technology is now such that it really allows us to have a really good approach to outcome measure collection. We can use video footage on a Teams call. We can combine that with the use of sensors, some that we have recently explored and piloted the use of are even remotely enabled so that we can start and stop the sampling on a live video call, which produces a whole new range of possibilities for rare conditions. So here we will hopefully strike a balance between rigor and actual feasibility of getting good quality outcome measures by using a combination of live video calls, one visiting assessor. We have to have somebody visiting for the very first fitting because there is some degree of need to personalize the suit configuration per person. Everybody's different size and shape. Everybody has different distribution, slightly of spasticity within the body. And what we're trying to do is not reinvent the wheel, but actually run with what the current manufacturer's protocols are in order to not disadvantage the potential effectiveness of the suit shining through. If the manufacturers believe that you have to target certain muscle groups in certain ways to really reveal the true effects, then we're going to pragmatically go with that. A more kind of purist mechanisms-based researcher might want to manipulate that and control the locations very carefully. But there's an argument for and against pragmatic approach or purist approach. And maybe that's something that you guys could also give us a steer on. So here's the set of outcome measures that we were thinking of incorporating into the evaluation. Outcome measures can make or break a clinical trial. It's so important to get them right. We need to choose something that is meaningful in the real world. So if I was to measure your body sway speed with your feet in a tandem stance, with your eyes closed, and find a very small but significant change in score, what does that mean? It might not have any impact on everyday life. So we need to find a measure which is meaningful for you guys, so that if you invest your time, even if we get NHS commissioning eventually in this management approach, even if you invest your time, you see a return from it. Because if you don't, then arguably there isn't much point in pursuing this as a management. But we also need that measure to be sensitive to revealing a result. So it has to be specific enough to measure something over a short time frame. We can't just endlessly have funding to carry on measuring for years and years. So we need to be able to capture something that's sensitive, but reliable and meaningful. And we finally need something that we can do remotely. So there we go, moon on a stick, please. But here's some of the ideas that we have thought about incorporating. So we need to know, first of all, what is your baseline? So for you guys, it's going to be really important to get a measure of spasticity And as Gabby and John have described, we now have a really good candidate in the pendulum swing test that we could use. Fatigue has been spoken about at least 3 times today, and I think is obviously a very important measure to capture. But fatigue's an interesting one, because if this does work, you might find yourself doing more activity and then getting more tired. So we need to contextualize any measures of fatigue as well as taking that measure. And that goes hand in hand with walking as well. Pain, hopefully this suit wouldn't cause any pain, but it's really important for us to know about that. And if it did cause pain, then we would have to list that as a potential burden, as well as make it, communicating any potential effects. We also want to know about potential poor effects. Mood, self-efficacy, and false confidence. So mood, again, you might think, well, if there's more independence, if you can move more easily, if you have less spasticity, that might improve. Or conversely, you might experience more fatigue and mood might go down temporarily. Really important to be able to know what the starting point is and any changes that might occur. Self-efficacy refers to how intrinsically confident you feel to go for something, to feel empowered to do something and in control of that. So that's really important, because if we don't feel in control of, let's say, functional exercise, we may be inhibited to do it. So hopefully, if the Mollii suit works, it would not only give you a physical boost, but also psychologically you feel more ready to take on new challenges and be more independent generally as well. So really important to know about. And then diaries. So diaries might seem like a kind of very simple approach to take in research, but they're tremendously powerful. The first-hand account, the first-hand experience gives a lot of good contextual information that we must not discount. Ultimately, the NHS is going to want to know about cost, unsurprisingly. So there are some measures out there, one called the EQ5D, which measures quality of life. It's not brilliant. Some of you might have encountered it in various appointments in the hospital to date. Very vague questions. It's not particularly very responsive to short-term change, but we know that that's a regular measure that the NHS uses to evaluate costs. So we'll have to incorporate some of these standard measures. And then we've got a whole range, as discussed, relative to the pendulum test. We've got a whole range of other types of measures that we could do in the home environment. So looking at postural body sway, drawing on those that past mechanisms work, looking at that slow response to balance perturbations. Well, if we change spasticity, might we see a difference in those response times? And could that actually facilitate stiller standing, decreased instability in the everyday, with everyday tasks? 5-meter walk, that's another standard assessment measure frequently used in trials such as this. The scale for assessment and rating of ataxia is actually one that hasn't been validated for HSP, and it incorporates a whole range of objective measures like sitting balance, standing balance, moving one foot down the other shin. It's been validated for persons with ataxia, but arguably it could be really relevant for persons with HSP. So we could incorporate that into our mix. And then the action research arm test involves a whole range of different reaching, grasp, pinching activities, which again gives an upper limb measure. And the reason that we're trying to incorporate upper limb measures is that we would really love this trial to be really inclusive. So for those of you who are full-time or close to full-time wheelchair users, the suit could potentially still be of benefit for upper limb activity. And we don't really want to exclude anybody that it could be potentially beneficial for. So we want to try and strike a balance of outcomes to capture everything. Okay, so I think that's a bit of an overview of what we have in mind as a starting point. What we vitally need now is a strong steer on how to proceed. So if this is a trial that is potentially of interest to persons with HSP, how should we go about refining this initial idea to make it appropriate, meaningful, acceptable, doable? Can it be done at home? Would you feel happier working with a buddy at home to do the outcome measures, or could it just be done remotely with a therapist online? You know, what additional equipment might you need to make sure that this is safe and doable? How long would it be appropriate to spend doing all of these outcome measures? So there was quite a list of different things that we'd like to collect, but that could equate to an hour and a half of testing. You know, is that practically going to be realistic? Should we prioritize what we want to collect measures of, etc.? There's so much that has yet to be thought through thoroughly and decided upon. So on that note, I wonder if we could potentially open up the floor for any questions and to invite any comments or ideas